All right, we're going to be moving on to a discussion of Hinduism. We've been focusing on religions and cultures of Southeast Asia, and Hinduism is a very significant major religion in Southeast Asia, particularly in India. Now, one thing about Hinduism that's going to be distinct from some of the other religions we've talked about is there's not really like a specific starting place where Hinduism began, and maybe with like one leader. For example, we talked about Islam starting with the Prophet Muhammad, or Christianity starting with Jesus Christ in Jerusalem. We have Hinduism is considered one of the oldest world religions. It's believed to be over 4,000 years old. And Hinduism really is a collection of different ideas and practices that developed distinctly over time. And Hinduism is practiced differently according to different regions that it's practiced, and with different like other traditions that become consolidated into Hinduism. So let's get into some of the details of Hinduism. So Hinduism really is this belief in a vast pantheon of gods, and a vast pantheon of different ideologies coming together. So, a lot of different folk beliefs become integrated, and different philosophies become integrated into Hinduism. So there's this idea that there's this infinite variety of the divine. So polytheism is it's considered a polytheistic religion, meaning that there's lots of different Hindu gods, and people will sort of worship different gods for different purposes, or different places will worship them for different reasons. And that these gods and deities are ever changing, and really manifest this single unity, which is this idea of the universe is one. So while it is polytheistic in the sense that there's lots of different gods, they all work in harmony to service this larger idea of the universe. So there's arguments to be made that this is monotheistic in a certain sense. There are texts associated with Hinduism that have become important over long periods of time, and there's different schools of thought as to how those texts come about. Some of them believe that that certain texts are divine in origin. The Vedic texts, or the Vedas, are considered some of the most important texts, and there are beliefs that these have divine origin. And that there are different parts of Hinduism that, like I say, like are manifest in different areas, but some of the central ideas of Hinduism are is the idea of the life cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, which we saw in Buddhism, which Buddhism came from Hinduism, basically. So we have this idea of birth, death, and rebirth. So this cycle of life, this belief that through good actions, you can potentially break yourself out of that cycle. One of the important parts as well is the idea of a caste system, which is a social hierarchy. And we're going to talk a lot about that on the next slide when I have like a uh, showing what that caste system looks like. But, again, going back to this idea of Buddhism, we had this idea of like, death, or birth, death, and rebirth. And depending on your actions in this life, your karma, you will be reborn into like a higher caste, or a higher social position, or a lower one, depending on those actions. And that's this idea of karma manifesting itself. So there's also this belief that you have certain social roles, depending on your caste system, or what level of social hierarchy you're in. But there's also this idea that there are different times of your life to focus on different actions. So, for example, like your early life is supposed to be focused on learning and education, study. Then there's a time for procreation, a focus on family, and then retirement, when you shift your focus from family to religion. So there's this idea that there's always these actions you should be taking according to what social status you have and what time of life you're experiencing. So you always have this evolving role of what you should be doing in your life. And then this idea that when you do release yourself from worldly desires and worldly focus, then you can achieve moksha, which is sort of an equivalent to nirvana a little bit. So similarities to Buddhism, again, Buddhism extends itself, or it came from this context of Hindu worship, as we have this belief in Mount Meru, this axis mundi, the center of the universe. We're going to see that manifest in art and architecture. And then also this idea of breaking out of the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, this reincarnation. So themes of rebirth and reincarnation are really common in Hindu art. And some of the most common gods you'll see that are worshipped are Shiva, the destruction, the destroyer, or destruction rebirth of the world is sort of encompassed within Shiva. Brahma is the creator and Vishnu is the preserver. So we're going to see manifestations of these gods. So I wanted to just kind of, again, there's lots of gods that can be worshipped, but those we find them very commonly represented in art and architecture. This is a slide to explain the caste system within Hinduism. So the idea of the caste system is that there is this social hierarchy, and there's this tension between this idea that the comparison that the caste system has is parts of the body, right? So there's this idea that there's certain parts of the body that perform certain functions, but they all have to work in harmony in order to accomplish good things. But of course, there's still a hierarchy in the sense that there are castes that are considered higher up and better, that people would have earned better karma to achieve those positions as opposed to lower castes. So some of the caste system is represented by the Brahmins, who are priests and academics. So if you're born into a life of study, and or if you're born into this world, you're a Brahmin. A Kshatriya are people that are normally in positions of power. Oh, positions of power. Sorry. Like rulers, administrators, warriors, those are Kshatriyas. You have the Vaishyas, who are artisans, tradesmen, farmers, merchants. The Shudras are manual laborers, and then the Dalits are the untouchables or the street cleaners. And you'll see in this image which part of the body each of these are associated with. So the Brahmins are associated with the head, the Kshatriyas with the shoulders, the Vaishyas with the legs, the Shudras the feet, and the Dalits are actually considered not to be part of it because they're like bad, basically. They're considered separate from these things. Now, one of the parts of Hinduism that's important to understand about this idea of the caste system is there's this word dharma, and your dharma is an equivalent to this idea of your duty. So if you are a Brahmin, if you're born into a life of a Brahmin, your duty is to pursue academic study or priest or whatever that role is. And you are not meant to lower yourself. Or if you're a Shudra, if you're born into a family of manual laborers, you are not meant to reach above your station. You are meant to be a manual laborer. And really, the way to build good karma is to be the best Shudra possible, to fulfill your dharmic responsibility to the best of your ability. You're not supposed to move between the systems in your life. And it's looked down upon quite a lot to, for example, like intermarry between these caste systems or to try to reach, beyond your caste. And this still in certain parts of India plays quite a significant role. And there's actually laws in place in India as to how to handle these kind of caste systems because it still presents itself as quite a big problem sometimes in the social order. When we look at Hindu art and architecture, we have this seamless integration of art and architecture. So we're going to see a lot of art that is incorporated into the architecture through like sculpture work, or through altars or things like that, or paintings or things like that being put into architectural spaces. We're going to see a lot of examples of dance. Dance has a lot of associations with performances of the gods. So this idea that when the god does something, it's like destroys the earth or builds the earth or something, it's done through a dance. So you're going to see a lot of exaggerated poses of figures that are meant to emphasize this idea of a dance. You will also see a lot of depictions of sexuality. That's something that's quite embraced within Hindu context. And it's not ever done in an overtly sexual way. It's more meant to be this indication of, this time of life where regeneration is emphasized. So this idea that there's certain times of your life where procreation is happening, and so sexuality and sex is associated with that fulfilling your responsibility, your dharma, essentially. There's a lot of images of deities or icons, and they often are put into church context. We'll say church, like temple complexes. And there's this idea that they are imbued with God's divinity. So there is a worship of these sculptures or these these icons sometimes. There will be offerings that will be placed at them at their feet as a way of being pious, worshiping. And sometimes they're so holy that only certain people are allowed to touch them. There is this idea that you are supposed to actively experience these works of art. It's not like they're just meant to decorate a place, but you're meant to go, depending on how holy the object is, touch it, make an offering to it, do these things. So oftentimes when you go into these spaces, you're going to see food, flowers, lots of things that are being put in front of it as this offering from devout worshipers. And most of the things that we're going to be looking at are made using a lost wax process. So let's look at some examples. All right, here is our first work of art that we're going to look at for Hinduism. So feel free to take a minute and look at this, see if there's anything you recognize, anything that any symbols that stick out to you that we can talk about. So clearly we have a figure here, and the figure is shown in a pretty extreme pose that is actually going to give the implication of dance. And we talked about that a little bit before, that dance often has association with godly activity. So let's talk about who this is. So the depiction we have here is Shiva as Lord of Dance. The title is Nataraja, which translates to Lord of the Dance with a nimbus. So Shiva is a god who is the destroyer of the world, but also the simultaneous destroyer and creator of the world. So this idea of destruction is not meant to be like a bad thing. It's meant to be this idea that, in order for things to continue on, there has to be birth, death, rebirth, right? Like that this cycle is going to be continuing on. So Shiva is presented here with idealized features and proportions, eyes shaped like lotus leaves, round moon face, and very calm expression. So the calmness of Shiva's expression is actually kind of antithetical to what's happening. There's actually a lot going on in the scene. In fact, you have this giant nimbus or halo surrounding Shiva that has all of these spikes coming from it that is actually meant to represent fire. So Shiva is in this flaming fire dance, which is chaotic, but we have this very calm expression. So this idea that like calm through the chaos. The flying hair of Shiva terminates in cobra heads. Cobras also have connotations with cycles and death and rebirth, because this idea that snakes will shed their skin and renew themselves periodically. So there's this idea that this like ever, moving cycle of renewal. So we don't know about the provenance of this statue, meaning we don't know exactly where this came from, but we do know that this is it's used often in worship. It's located in the womb chamber of a temple, which is like the most, kind of like the deepest portion and most interior portion, so quite a sacred site. It is also periodically brought out to be used in rituals and in festivals, and the statue will literally be moved along. That will give this sense of dance and movement to continue this idea of what we see in the statue. Shiva is also shown with a foot on the demon of ignorance. So this idea that of conquering of the demon of ignorance. And then we have another foot that's up with a hand pointing at it, giving this idea of regeneration and breaking free. So there's actually 4 arms and 4 hands associated with those arms, which is a common feature in some Hindu gods, is multiple appendages doing things simultaneously. In one of the arms on like the most right hand arm, which you have to think like this side, there is a drum in the hand of Shiva, and the drum is this idea that when you hit a drum, you make this beat, and this is the beat, the continual beat of the movement of the universe. So this idea of marking the creation, the passage of time. In the other hand, on the other side, the figure is holding an Agni, which is a flame, which represents destruction, which again goes to this idea of destruction and creation. There's also a mudra that the figure has. A mudra, remember, being these like hand symbols that have meanings associated with them that Buddha sculptures are often depicted with specific hand symbols. And this mudra means fear not. And then the last hand gesture we see is a diagonal line that is pointing at a raised left foot, which represents grace and fulfillment through meditation. And this meditation can lead to this breaking of the cycle. So this like freedom from ignorance, from the cycle, like these kind of ideas. And then again, we have this nimbus or this halo surrounding the entire thing, which is this representation of the cosmos, mass, time, space, this big thing being encompassed in this small space, like a microcosm. All right, so we looked at an example of sculpture. Now we're going to talk specifically about Hindu architecture, and I have here art and architecture because art is very integrated into the architecture, but we're going to focus on sort of this relationship and really styles of architecture within Hinduism. So for Hinduism, there's not going to be churches or congregational worship sites in the way that we think about other religions like Christianity or mosque structures. Instead, we're going to see temples that are dedicated to gods, and they're meant to be sort of the house or the place where, like the residence of the gods. So it's a place that you can go and visit the gods, basically, but it's not going to be this big congregational site. There's not going to be a person there that's going to be like preaching. It's going to be a place where an individual person comes, honors the gods, participates in worship, and then leaves, right? So we have very small interior rooms and thick walls. That's partially because you didn't really need big spaces, right? But structurally, it also allows for things to be constructed very large in a very large way. Sometimes there will be many temples sort of put together in this large format, which creates a temple complex. So a temple complex basically becomes like a temple, almost like an apartment complex for the gods, right? Like there's lots of different areas for different gods that reside there, and then you can go to the different areas and worship the individual gods. You'll see a lot of evidence of horror vacui. So this idea, again, the fear of empty space, filling every corner with sculpture, with imagery, with some sort of narrative, something so that you have something to look at, something to contemplate, telling of stories, that kind of thing. Similar to Buddhist architecture, there's going to be a focus on ideas of cosmology and the order of the universe. A lot of the temples are going to have some symbolism associated with Mount Meru. So the idea of this axis mundi, the center of the universe, and a person sort of navigating and circumambulating, which we'll see examples of, but circumambulating, going around in circles into these places. And then often also giving the symbolism of a mandala. Mandala design is essentially like this kind of structure that extends and pulses outward that creates this really interesting effect and gives this idea of like order of the universe, but infinity at the same time. There are different types of temple styles. We're not going to really worry too much about that. There are northern and southern styles of Indian Hindu temples. I don't really need you to worry too closely about that, but if you want to learn more about that, there's plenty online that you can look into. So the first temple we're going to be looking at is this temple that you see here. I thought this was a good image to show you the scale of this of the place. It's clearly very large, very tall, but you'll notice that there's a lot, like it's very like I don't want to say bulky, but like filled out, right? Like there's a lot of like mass to it, which tells you that there is a importance to the actual structure and the narrative. And again, it's not meant to be this huge in open airy interior space. It's not meant for congregational worship. This is the Lakshmana Temple in India. This is part of a series of 80 different temples in this area that were commissioned by the head of the Chandela dynasty. And this entire area was filled with temples as a form of worship, as a form of giving, the citizens in this area somewhere to go, somewhere to be able to worship the gods. The crest for the Chandela dynasty includes a lion. So there's lots of depictions of lions and sculpture work of lions here. And this particular temple is dedicated to Vishnu, who is going to be a figure in the very center womb chamber. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. So sculpture is seamlessly integrated into the architecture. It's, synonymous with it, right? Like the architecture really wouldn't make sense without the sculpture, and the sculptures wouldn't really make sense without the architecture. They're meant to be put together. So there's lots of different stories here, stories from the gods, stories of daily life, stories from history. There's just like a lot going on. We could spend like all day just talking about each of the narratives. We're just going to focus on a couple, but there's lots of different images of gods and incarnations of gods, which are known as avatars. So lots of different incarnations of Vishnu specifically, because that's who this temple is mostly dedicated to. There's a whole section that's quite famous because it has a multitude of images of entwined couples. So again, going back to this idea that there is sexuality being depicted, but it's not highly eroticized. It's not meant to be something like pornographic by any means. It's meant to be a depiction of pleasure, procreation, this important time of life where procreation is part of your responsibility to produce children. So there's like a display of it as sort of like an honoring of like that time of your life. Here's some pictures of the design of the temple, the actual construction. The entire temple is built on this plinth or this platform that has these steps that go upward. So then you're off of the ground. So you're elevated off the ground. And then you have, when you enter in from the front entrance, you are meant to go in the direction of the sunrise and you're meant to um go circumambulate. So you're supposed to circle around and there's actually four subsidiary temples. So these four sort of corners on the plinth with smaller temples that you go worship the gods in each of these temples before you keep circumambulating and then enter the womb chamber, which is the centermost part, which is the most important area. And you know it's the most important area because there's also this very large tower right there that indicates that. So you have this very small, narrow ambulatory or this small walkway that are crowned with mandapas. Mandapas are basically like these coverings to make like almost like a porch area. So it's like outside, but it has a covered walkway. And the tallest part of the temple, like I was saying, this very tall part crowning the womb chamber is known as the Shikara, to give you a sense that that is the most important area, the womb chamber. And it's I keep saying womb chamber, but when you think about a womb is like this, part of a body, a woman's body where something is like an embryo grows. And so it's this idea of like the most interior part, the most like sacred part is associated with this space. Here's some of the sculptures just to give you a sense of what some of them look like. This is an example of one of the iterations of an avatar of Vishnu. This is an elephant version, but there's lots of arms protruding out, horror vacui, lots of things going on, not a lot of empty space. Here's another image of the plan. So you can see that you enter in from this walkway and then you will travel and circumambulate the whole space, stopping at these subsidiary shrines or these like mini temples basically for these gods. And then you would enter the mandapa and eventually end up in the womb chamber. This is another image just to give you an idea. They have the mandapas, the covered walkways, and then the Sikara, which is the crowning tallest portion. Here's some other sculptures that are here. This one I think is really interesting because it's just so normal, mundane. It's a sculpture of a woman removing a thorn from her foot, which is just seems like such a mundane activity, especially when you juxtapose it with all the different things. But it goes to show what a variety of images you have. You have daily life, gods, avatars, erotic couples, right? Like there's just so many things going on to really show the magnitude of the universe and also the mundane parts of the universe, right? It's like a really cool idea of like the macro and the micro simultaneously. This is a depiction of the figural groupings of the erotic couple. So if you wanted to spend some time, you can look and see all the different couplings here showing this important time of a person's life. And here is the womb chamber showing the sculpture of Vishnu. It has been quite what's the word I'm looking for? Like deteriorated over time because people touch it and make offerings here, and this is a very important sculpture. But this is regarded as the most important figure in the whole temple because the temple is dedicated to Vishnu, and this is the sculpture displaying that. All right, we're going to look at our last work of Hindu architecture. It is actually the largest religious architectural structure in the entire world. And what I mean by that is it's a complex that encompasses a really large swath of land. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. But this is Angkor Wat. This is a giant complex located in Cambodia. Cambodia is a nation at the sort of southeastern part of Asia, east of India, north of Malaysia. and above the South China Sea. So the Temple of Angkor Wat is located in the city of Angkor Thom. So this is a large, large city in Cambodia. It was built by basically an emperor from the Khmer Empire. It eventually, when it reached its zenith at the highest point that it had people with over 1 million people, which is the largest city in the world in the pre-industrial world. So the fact that this was so massive was a feat in and of itself. The city was started by Surya Varman II, and established this as the capital of the medieval area of Cambodia, and several successive kings added to this complex. Now, the monument itself is massive because it's actually several temples and several complexes sort of put together, and encompasses over 402 acres of land, which is over 304 football fields combined together. So it's absolutely massive. The construction of this particular temple started about around 1116 CE, and the first installment of it only took about 35 years to construct, which is really, really fast when you're using these kind of materials and this kind of engineering. It's really fast to be able to put something up so quickly like this. Originally, it was dedicated to Vishnu. Over time, as Cambodia became more Buddhist, this actually became a Buddhist complex, but there's still obviously examples from Hindu art and sort of an integration of these two traditions together. So the temple, like we've said before, like other temples, is meant to serve as a godly abode. And so there's lots of different places for different gods that are being honored here. But it's also meant to be as a way to legitimize the rule of the king. So there's lots of depictions of kings and rulers, and potentially this might have been a mausoleum when it was first constructed by Suryavarman II, like basically where he would be buried. There's lots of different influences we see here. We have corbelled vaulting, which we'll talk about in just a second, and also lots of canonical towers. And the canonical towers are going to look very similar to what we saw in Lakshmana. That's very much influenced by Hinduism from the Indian continent, coming over here a little bit more east, southeast. So this mixture of Buddhist and Hindu influences. The horror vacui sculptural reliefs is very much Hindu in origin. The repetition of shapes, fractal like floor plan, this representation of a mandala pattern. This is more Hindu influence. Use of rhythmic dancing and poses in the relief sculptures. This is also very Hindu. The canonical towers with a central, with a reference to Mount Meru as the Axis Mundi. That's kind of a mix of Buddhism and Hinduism because that's the belief in both of these religions. The South Gate of Angkor Thom, which you see here, is an example of this corbelled vaulting, which you'll notice I have a picture here to show what a corbelled vault looks like. So it's basically a way to make a archway like this, but using stoneworks in these rectangular shapes. So the complex itself has a main pyramid structure with four canonical towers surrounding it, and then these galleries that are surrounding it with lots of narrative relief sculptures. There are lots of nested walls, and there's actually a moat as well that was meant to signal purification. This has religious significance, but it's also meant to be something that helps with crops around the area and also makes it so that the jungle doesn't get super overgrown. This is meant to serve as a symbol of the Axis Mundi or the Mount Meru. And the depiction we have here at the bottom is a depiction of Jayavarman the Seventh, who was another very famous Khmer monarch, and he was actually a Buddhist leader, and so he is depicted here as himself, but depicted as Buddha, sort of like a combination of the two, with these closed eyes, smiling faces, peaceful detachment, these ideas that are important for Buddhism. This is another really fascinating relief sculpture panel. This is on one of the gallery walls. This is 160 feet long, about 6.5 feet tall. So it's massive relief sculpture that was put into the wall. And it tells the story of this idea basically of these gods that had to band together with demons to churn the ocean of milk. So there's this idea that there's this nectar of immortal life called Amrita, and the gods and the demons had to work together to wrap this serpent king Vasuki around this mountain, and they had to pull back and forth to churn the nectar out, essentially. And then as this comes out, Indra, who's considered the king of the gods, swoops in and collects it and makes sure it's used for proper, like good purposes, as opposed to what the demons wanted to use it for. And I have a great video about it that we're going to watch here. And then that will be it for our unit on Indian and Southeast Asian art.
Angkor Wat's walls are covered with 12,900 square feet of bas-relief carvings. Executed with great skill and artistic sophistication, the reliefs are considered a masterpiece in their own right. These carvings cover multiple blocks of sandstone and are so perfectly fitted together that the seams are almost invisible. Even the detailed lintels at the top of the walls are carved from the same stone blocks. Each artist would cut away layers of the wall and then carve the reliefs directly into the stone. Hundreds of highly skilled carvers worked side by side to complete the work in only decades. Experts admire not only the expressive human figures in the carvings, but also the remarkable perspective these early artists were able to achieve. The carvings encircle the entire outer gallery from floor to ceiling. Measuring 2,600 feet, it is the longest continuous bas-relief in the world. In the North Gallery, this famous relief, called the Battle of Kurukshetra, depicts an ancient combat scene from Indian history retold in the epic work, the Mahabharata. Continuing along to the Southern Gallery, visitors encounter a 260-foot depiction of Suryavarman II's full royal procession. Military leaders, priests, musicians, standard bearers, servants, and royalty all take their place in this carving. The carving's centerpiece is the famous portrait of Suryavarman II himself. Lingering traces of gold hint at its former splendor. The famous portrait of the king was gilded and surrounded by red, the color symbolizing protection and strength. Continuing to the East Side Gallery, a visitor finds perhaps the most famous and revered of all the reliefs, the churning of the Sea of Milk. It depicts Vishnu and Devas, the benevolent Hindu gods, and the Asuras, the evil gods, all pulling on a great snake to churn the cosmic sea in search of eternal life. Their struggle released countless deities, including the beautiful nymphs called Apsaras. In the Northern Gallery is a battle of the gods and demons. This epic battle scene illustrates the pantheon of 21 Hindu gods battling alongside human warriors. Led by Vishnu, the gods of good defeat the evil gods. And as Suryavarman II was considered an earthly avatar of Vishnu, the scene celebrates his reign as well.